Hi, welcome to episode 2 of Music Between the Numbers. My name is Andy Jaski, and in this series of videos, we go through the Billboard Top 10 songs from 1955 to 2020 and look at how music has changed quantitatively over time. Last week we went through the chord counts per song and saw that those peaked in the 1970s and dropped to a low in the most recent decade. After last week, I had some feedback that some of the musical tech talk was a bit complicated, so I'll try to backtrack a little this week and just boil that down to the basics that are important to understand as we review the music and the numbers. This week, we'll talk about 2 Spotify audio features that I think are a bit more intuitive, even though they might be difficult to measure. Those are danceability and energy. So let's go to the PowerPoint and get into the details. So let's take a step back on 2 topics. First, on music terminology, and second, on statistics terminology, both at a very basic level. So one question I heard, what is a chord? This seems like common knowledge to me and probably is to those who play either guitar or piano, but it might not be for everyone. I'm going to assume everyone knows what a melody is and everyone knows what harmony is, the background notes to the main melody of a song. When you have at least 3 note sounds at the same time, the one that is most prominent can be considered the melody, but if you combine that with the harmony sounds, you get a chord. A 3-note chord is called a triad. Obviously, you can have more than 3 notes, so the more chords you have, the more complex harmonies you have. And there is also an opportunity for complex melodies depending on how the song is written. The other aspects of music I talked about last week really boil down to one thing. How human sounding is the performance? Does it sound like people doing the performance, or something managed via a computer with a lot of electronic effects? For example, there are a lot of programmed drums now as opposed to live drumming in the past. There's also auto-tune that makes vocals sound more electronic. In sum, that's what all those other items boil down to without getting into too much music tech talk. Now on the median and the mean, I want to make sure people know what those are. The mean is the same as the average. You add up all the numbers and divide by the number of observations, and that's it. The median is the middle number in a series of numbers. So let's go back to my Jack Sigma accounting major and first-round NBA pick example. Say there were 11 accounting grads the year he graduated, and 5 had starting salaries of $12,000, 5 had starting salaries of $14,000, but Jack's NBA salary was $500,000. Those numbers are all made up. Here we get a median of $14,000, but an average around $57,000. Wow, that's some accounting department. So the median is less sensitive to the large outlier. Note here too that if we had 100 other grads instead of just 10 other grads, while still a little high, the average wouldn't be too far out of range of the median. The 3 lessons here are, first, frame the measure properly. It really should exclude Jack Sigma's salary if you're trying to describe accounting major salaries. 2, be careful about large outliers. And 3, large sample sizes should generally help cure a lot of data woes. For other statistical measures, I'm just going to assume either you know them or you don't, and you'll have to make do with the context. These include standard deviation, correlation, regression, and standardization and normalization of variables. Some of these things we'll incorporate in weeks to come. Don't worry. The basic measures and graphs are clear enough that you don't really have to know this stuff for this set of videos. So the bottom line from last week can be summarized in this slide. The number of chords per song has changed through time for the top 10 songs of each year. This is one element that may lead to music that sounds different today than it did 20, 30, or 40 years ago. Now, simple isn't always a bad thing, but it can get repetitive and seem boring if you are used to hearing more complex music. Jazz, for example, has very complex structures, and people who are big fans of jazz are rarely huge fans of popular music. In fact, older pop music more often, but not always, incorporated some elements of jazz. Now, Spotify has numerous quantitative features that they measure about each song, and they use these to help match songs for listeners, to find other things you might like if you listen to certain songs because the features are correlated. Now, data scientists call these features. Old statistics guys, like me, call these variables, or Mr. Chekhov on Star Trek would have called them variables, Captain. Or they sometimes have been called attributes or characteristics, but apparently there weren't enough names, so data scientists decided that features had to be added to the list. So here's a brief technical note on pulling those features and how to do it if you are interested. If you're really interested, just contact me. You might just be interested in knowing the features for a particular song. Okay, so we're going to go through a lot of features in the weeks to come, but let's start with something that has a lot of hearsay around what might be indicators of how music has changed. Those are danceability and energy. And here are the Spotify definitions for those metrics. Okay, when you look at those definitions, there's a lot of music techie talk in them. But I think they make general sense, and I think the words and the concepts are intuitive enough to most folks to just move along. We don't have the detailed specifics on how Spotify does the actual measurement, as that is something they treat as proprietary, although they do reference some articles on the topic. So we see that the rating goes between 0 and 1. Basically, think of it as 0% for 0 and 100% for 1. So let's look at some kind of fun stuff that's basically sense checks on the data, and we also learn a little bit about the data this way. One of my pet peeves with machine learning is that it can be a bit dangerous if only the machine understands the data and there's no human oversight. So one way would be to look at which songs out of our 660 songs rank in the top 10 and bottom 10 on these measures. We might even be able to think of some songs that might rank high or low on these measures. For me, the song The Macarena came to mind immediately. If ever there was a song that was a hit only because it was danceable, it had to be The Macarena. I have a little story about that song. Once I started patting myself at the security entrance at the airport to make sure nothing was in my pockets, and the TSA guy wittily chimed in, Airport Macarena. Okay, let's see, what's its value? Well, look at that. It does come in at number 7 for danceability. So yeah, that's pretty sensible. And the list as a whole seems to make sense. So let's look at the bottom 10. These seem to make some sense too. While many of these songs are songs that I like and are very good listening songs, they aren't written for dancing. The Hello Dolly value of 0 looks like an error of some kind. As I went through all of the Spotify features that we'll discuss, this one seemed like the oddest one and the biggest outlier. A different version of the song came in at 0.38, which seems a bit more correct. But I decided to just leave this observation in, a judgment call there. I show 11 songs on this list here just to be sure we are grabbing an actual bottom 10 at least. And the impact of that observation on the overall data is minimal. Okay, so now let's look at the top 10 and bottom 10 for energy, a little vaguer concept. While there is some similarity in nature, it isn't exactly the same songs. So here are the top and bottom 10 on these next two slides for both of these metrics, and they're paired up with the other metric, so danceability and energy put together. There's only one song that is in the top 10 on both lists and one song that is in the bottom 10 on both lists. This made me wonder just how correlated are these two metrics? And so I ran a simple correlation coefficient, and it comes in at 0.33, and if we run a regression, we get statistically significant correlation, but only about 11% of the variability of danceability is explained by the variation in energy. So that was a mouthful, so let's boil it down. While there is some correlation, they are still at least somewhat independent measures, meaning they are measuring somewhat different things. Finally, let's add the two together and see what the top 10 songs would be for the sum of danceability and energy. Hollaback Girl hits the top of our list while Dean Martin is there at the bottom. Okay, the data for these seem to be sensible enough based on the songs near the top or bottom. So let's move to the main question in our study. Have these measures changed over time? This week, we'll just stick with looking at things by decade rather than also cultural decade, just to keep it simpler. First, danceability. We see that it has indeed increased over time. The changes aren't quite as dramatic as chords per song, but they are still substantial. The biggest jump actually occurred from the 60s to the 70s. Think of Saturday Night Fever. And then again from the 70s to the 80s and 90s. And we see the highest numbers after 2000 and a strong distinction from the earlier years. Next, let's take a look at energy, and this one has changed too, but actually approached today's levels in the 1980s music and then dropped back off in the 1990s. I think what we see here is that there were quite a few ballads in the 1990s that reached the top 10 range. Songs like I Will Always Love You, I Believe I Can Fly, and Candle in the Wind. And of course, we see the highest numbers after 2000 and a strong distinction from the earlier years. Now, let's add these two items together and look at the pattern. We essentially see it increasing through time with a slight drop from those 1990s ballads, and it peaks after 2000 with just a slight drop in the last decade. One thing that struck me from looking at the titles in the top 10 and bottom 10 is that popular songs seem to vary less along these dimensions than in the past. If that's the case, then the standard deviation of these two values should be trending down. For danceability, this is definitely true. For energy, the standard deviation is relatively flat until a drop in the last decade. So in popular music post-2000, there's simply less variability, with more emphasis on danceability and less on listening songs. This week, we've examined two more quantitative measures of how music has changed throughout time: danceability and energy. And indeed, like chord counts, they have changed over the period 1955 to 2020. Next week, we'll take a look at two additional features: loudness and speechiness. And hey, if you have 3 minutes in the meantime, go to Spotify and listen to my new single, The Whole World Struggles. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week and happy listening. Thanks for joining me.